You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 3rd of July, 2024 on Monocle Radio.
The UK, perhaps 24 hours, give or take, from an end to 14 years of Conservative government. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni wonders how all these dreadful xenophobes got into her party, and it's more ethically complex than it may sound, should police officers steal from traffic accident scenes? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Isabel Hilton and Anand Menon will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the author Raphael Baer about his new book outlining how to stay sane as politics goes crazy. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Isabel Hilton, international journalist and visiting professor at King's College London's Lau Institute and founder of China Dialogue, and by Anand Menon, professor of European politics and foreign affairs at King's College London and the director of the UK in a Changing Europe think tank. Hello to you both.
Hiya.
Good evening.
Anand, we will start with you. I think it is your first appearance on the Daily, certainly in its President? You can tell what I've been thinking about today, can't you? In its present incarnation, which is why we have, as is traditional, made you wear the owl costume that all Daily debutantes have to wear. But beyond that, if you could briefly introduce yourself to our listeners, explain who you think you are and how you got here, etc.
Well, who I think I am is very different to what everyone else thinks, but let me have a stab. I'm an academic. I'm based at King's College, and I run a little think tank called UK in a Changing Europe, which is weird because what we do is try and make academic research accessible to ordinary people.
That's a crazy idea.
It is, and a lot of academics would share that opinion.
Is it catching on?
Yeah, I think it has. I mean, we focus very much on UK-EU relations during the last sort of 10 years, and I think because we had this massive decision that no one really understood, there was a bit of a vacuum that we were able to fill. And, you know, there are an awful lot of academics who write on these things, a proportion of whom are able to do it in English.
Isabel, you have recently been visiting for journalistic purposes somewhere which is close to where Anand comes from, but I cannot overstress this in deference to the sensibilities of that part of the world, a very, very, very different, in no way similar place.
I'm almost careful. I mean, I'm almost concerned to say the word in front of Anand. I have been to Bradford.
Would you like to do a bit of light booing?
Well, I'm doing it internally.
Okay,
I've got to be childish to do it out loud.
Yeah.
Well, I'm very interested in Bradford for lots of reasons, and I think it's a story about Britain, which is, you know, interesting to tell. And it's the youngest city in the country. It's one of the poorest, was one of the richest. City of Culture next year. And the ambition for City of Culture,
somebody is really properly seething now,
is that Leeds will in future be referred to as a town near Bradford.
or a town near Wakefield. Do you want to speak up for the home patch at this point?
Well, obviously the major city in the region is Wakefield, followed by Leeds, and Bradford comes a distant third. I mean, very good food in Bradford, I have to say.
Believe.
Very good restaurants in Bradford.
I'm glad you said that, because it allows me to shamelessly declare that the one time I was in Bradford, which was at some point in the early 90s, because it was that night on the tour I was covering, I did attend Robert Smith Out of the Cure's birthday dinner at an Indian restaurant in Bradford. I forget which one. I don't know if there's a plaque or a statue or something like that.
Andrew was here.
I think the plaque would probably orient more towards Robert Smith having been there. But, you never know. But we will start here in the UK, which is kind of related to what we've been talking about. 24 hours we are now from an election day which polls anticipate will be, for the long-governing Conservative Party, the political equivalent of the charge of the Light Brigade, though likely to prompt significantly less solemn verse by the era's preeminent balladeer and a great deal more vindictive jeering from the population at large. The Tories' climactic messaging has been keen keen on the spectre of a Labour supermajority. I wish we had a thunderclap sound effect, which is, of course, an entirely meaningless concept in British politics. Anand, what have you made of the don't give Labour a supermajority tack? It does seem a bit like the imminent victim of a punishment beating saying, please don't shoot me in both kneecaps.
It does, and in a more sinister way, it smacks a little bit of voter suppression in the sense that one hoped for consequence of this, I think, is to make people who are sort of lukewarm Labour supporters think, well, if they're going to win by a mile, we won't bother. Generally, one of the reasons why we get low turnout in elections is if people think they already know the result. The other tends to be if people think there isn't much to choose between the two parties. I think both, in a way, apply at this election in terms of policy offer. So, you know, Labour, I think with a degree of reason, have accused the Conservatives of trying to put people off going to the ballot box by saying, look, you know the result anyway.
Do you think this is going to work, though, Isabel? Because my own sense of this, and this I've been, Lord knows I've been wrong before, is that this election has become a bit like one of those things where, you know, a movie or a record or a TV series comes out which everybody just decides is the worst thing in the world, and you get almost this competition among critics and people in the online realm trying to dish out the most imaginative pasting they possibly can. I get the sense that, you know, the British public's blood is up.
I think that's right. I think finding new ways to say how awful the Tories are has certainly been a blood sport since the election was called and maybe before it. But I think that there are I have no idea what the turnout's going to be here. And you normally have a sense that I normally trust the polls more, and I am very suspicious actually of the polling at the moment. But it may be this is an entirely unscientific assessment.
Suspicious, but I think, in that you're not buying the more apocalyptic predictions.
Yeah, and I think that there are a lot of people who would normally be expected to vote one way who are not going to, and that's quite hard to track, or they may not vote at all. So you've got Labour voters who are very, very angry about Gaza, and they won't vote. Where will they go? I mean, you know, they might go to George Galloway if they have the option. You've got Tories who might go to the Lib Dems or might go to Reform. You have people who would like to vote Green or will vote Green and plague on all their houses. Probably some Labour people will vote Green because they think Green's going to, you know, they think Labour's going to get in. So I just have a sense that it's a very fragmented landscape in a way that I don't normally feel that.
But I think that's true, and I think it's becoming truer over time in the sense that, in a sense, the British electorate has become unanchored from previous party loyalties. And you saw that with the so-called Red Wall in 2017 and 2019, that places that for reasons of tradition or family or this is just what we do here used to vote one way or the other have stopped doing it. And in a sense, that's fantastic because it does mean that now and looking forwards, politicians can't take voters for granted because the British electorate is hideously volatile. I think I read a figure in the British Election Studies recent book that was something like 49% of the British public changed the party they voted for between 2010 and 2017. And those figures are enormous by historical standards.
But that implies that the two major parties which are coalitions which no longer work. And
Yep.
Does that get us any closer to a more rational electoral system, like one in which voting for a minor party isn't a pointless act?
No, it doesn't. But
proportional measures in some way.
But one of the really interesting things about this election is if you look at some of the projections, it will be the least proportional outcome ever. It will be the lowest combined vote share for Labour and the Tories ever. And you could end up with a situation where Reform, conceivably get more, probably more likely get slightly fewer votes than the Conservatives, and the Conservatives get maybe 90 or 100 MPs and Reform get one. So I think the debate about the electoral system will restart after this election simply because it threatens to be so disproportionate with its outcome.
Just one final quick thought on this, Isabel, because we will have, of course, all week to discuss the actual result when we know them. But while you're here, do you get the sense that what is going on in Scotland is being somewhat overlooked? Because that is not insignificant. This does, everyone is focused on how bad this is going to be for the Conservatives across the country, and that is almost certainly the case. It's not going to be terrific for the Scottish National Party north of the border, is it?
Well, indeed not. But I think that, again, it's it's quite hard to know what the scale of that is. I mean, they have had a terrible couple of years. And at the last general election, they won pretty much every seat but one, didn't they? I mean, Labour got one seat, and they're not going to repeat that. But it's also been axiomatic in the past that Labour has to win Scotland to win. And I'm not sure they're going to... I don't think we're just going to get a flip of the last result. I think it's more likely to be more of a split, 50-50 split. And what that will do to Labour's overall result, Anna would know better than me.
I mean, I think Labour can now win without winning Scotland. I mean, Scotland's really interesting because there are a number of seats, particularly seats around the edges of the big cities, where there is a sort of head-to-head between the SNP and Labour that is simply too close to call. So the Scottish election is quite interesting relative to much of the rest of it. The other thing you should say, though, is interestingly, while support for the SNP has gone down, support for independence has remained absolutely rock solid. So sort of between 45 and 49% it has been all along. And one of the things that signals, I think, is if the SNP can get their act together, there is an electorate there waiting for them who might come back to them if and when the independence issue rises in salience again.
Well, to this week's paranoid outburst by weirdo hermit kingdom North Korea, it has teed off at joint military exercises involving South Korea, Japan and the United States, seething that the relationship between the countries involved has turned into something resembling an Asian NATO. Rodong Sinmun, newspaper of the Korean Workers' Party, doesn't appear to have covered the story, though we do glean that employees of the Songyo District Post Office, and I quote, encourage themselves through the mass cultural and artistic activities to perform feats and bring about innovations with revolutionary optimism and spirit. So that's something. Isabel, is there anything necessarily sinister about Operation Freedom Edge, as it is called?
Not particularly,
Other than the name of it, obviously.
I mean, we know that South Korea, Japan, the United States, Australia, New Zealand are all a bit worried about North Korea, but also, China, Russia, and they have been... they've been lining up to develop the capacity to respond coherently should there be an interruption, for example, in free passage through the Taiwan Strait or any of those things. And to operate cogently, you have to do exercises, you have to get some interoperability. It's fine. I don't, funnily enough, remember North Korea complaining when Russia and China were doing military exercises, as they have done throughout the Ukraine war, very close to Japan. And that's an alliance that I would say was probably rather stronger than the other one. It's not NATO. There's no Article 5. But there is a commitment. There is a sort of shared commitment to try to keep the peace in Asia.
Not for the first time next week, Anand. Representatives of Japan, South Korea, Australia and I think New Zealand will be attending the NATO summit. This has now started to become part of the furniture. I will admit, and regular listeners to the Foreign Desk will know, that a couple of years ago I did posit to Jens Stoltenberg, our guest in that episode, would it necessarily be outrageous if Pacific nations actually joined the alliance? Obviously, you would have to rename it, and you end up perhaps inevitably with Panto, which is something that would need work. But is this necessarily a terrible idea, that these similarly inclined countries, these sort of basic liberal democracies, should join the alliance established to defend liberal democracies?
No, it's not. And I mean, as Isabel hinted at, over the last few years, you've seen the development of security ties between Western nations and Asian nations and Indo-Pacific nations. You've seen the Indo-Pacific tilt of this country. Germany and France are doing something very, very similar. You've got the AUKUS Pact. It's not exactly rocket science that Western powers are concerned about China in particular and looking to strengthen their presence in the region. What I would say about NATO at the moment is one of the problems, of course, is we're not even sure if Article 5 works here, given what might be about to happen in the United States before we start thinking about extending it further afield.
Stoltenberg, I have to say, did play a very dead bat to my suggestions, but I have by now got used to that response to suggestions that I make to senior politicians and other officials. Isabel, We should also talk about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is meeting in Astana, which means that Putin and Xi will be meeting again. They're doing it quite frequently now. Do we get any real sense of how they are getting on at the moment, though? It is very hard to tell from Xi's body language. He never looks terribly pleased to be anywhere or happy to see anybody. But do we get any sense that China's patience with Russia's adventure in Ukraine is beginning to ebb?
They've met 40 times now, and that is a lot. And I don't know about the body language, but certainly if you want to track the amount of material, the amount of support that is going into Russia, which you can through Central Asia, and some of it doesn't even, it's a paper transaction. Some of it is logged through Central Asia and it just goes directly from China. There doesn't seem to be much of a slackening of support, though I think that if anything were to give Xi Jinping a slightly sleepless night, it would be the newly discovered friendship between North Korea and Russia, and particularly Russia making it much harder for the United Nations to track North Korea's nuclear development, which was in its beginnings a Russian program anyway. And the Chinese have had enough trouble with North Korea. They certainly don't want North Korea finding a good friend in Russia and feeling emboldened to cause more trouble. So they can sort of keep Russia on track, I think. But North Korea is an entirely different game.
Well, let's look at Italy, and the weary sceptic may mutter that Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni condemning fascists in her Brothers of Italy party is akin to Pope Francis surveying the Vatican and complaining that it's full of Catholics. Nevertheless, Meloni is volubly vexed by the emergence of footage of members of the Brothers of Italy's youth wing making enthusiastic pronouncements about Benito Mussolini, less enthusiastic judgments of Jews. Meloni thundered that, quote, "There is no room in Brothers of Italy for racism or anti-Semitism, nor is there space for those who are nostalgic for the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century or for any manifestation of foolish folklore." She has a turn of phrase. You do have to give her that, Anand. But do we detect there any notion of a nod or a wink, or do we think she's actually quite genuinely angry?
Well, it's impossible to tell unless you talk to her whether she's genuinely angry or not. But I think this is simply a byproduct of right-wing populist parties smelling power and wanting to go beyond the fringe vote that they used to attract and become mainstream. We see exactly the same thing in France, where Marine Le Pen coined the phrase, and it's really hard to say, dédiabolisation, which basically means sanitizing, de-devilization for the then National Front. That is to say, we have to become respectable to earn enough votes to get into power. And given that these parties, I mean, Giorgia Meloni is in power, the Rassemblement National in France wants to get into power. And so this is just an inevitable part of that, is that, you know, some of those people who were with us at the start and come out with unpleasant things like that, there is no space for them now. We want to be mainstream. I think that's just, you know, we see something very similar happening with Reform UK, actually, in this country.
I mean, it is a common problem, as Anand has just adumbrated there, Isabel, that is faced by populist parties. And I'm making this observation with precisely zero sympathy for their predicament. But you do have to indulge the headbangers and the crazies and the weirdos in order to build your base and build momentum and get elected, and then figure out a way to ditch them after you've won. Is that what we're seeing here?
I mean, it makes perfect sense. Meloni doesn't need them. She's got more to gain by being a reasonable, responsible leader figure. She has done some quite, some things which are quite reminiscent of earlier times in terms of judicial moves and press moves in Italy. She is an authoritarian figure, but she doesn't want to be seen as a headbanging authoritarian figure, because she wants to play a role in Europe. And, she has a reasonable shot at that.
It's also worth saying these people get quite wedded to power when they've tasted it.
There's also that. There is a wider question posed, though, Anand, obviously, if you look into the history of the Brothers of Italy, it is something of a gawp into the abyss. They do come from an extremely unpleasant place. But most political parties that have been around long enough have advocated something fairly revolting at some point or other in their history. How long do you hold that against them?
Well, I suppose you've got to judge a party by what it does and what it says in the present, and not. I mean, all parties have unpleasant fringes to them, or the vast majority of parties. I mean, especially in a system like ours, where you have to have a very, very broad church to compete for office, it's impossible to keep control over the whole party. But I think, you can't hold the past of a party against. So, I mean, Giorgia Meloni has governed very differently to how many people expected. I mean, even given what Isabel said, I think on a number of issues there is that authoritarianism, but nevertheless, she's governed far more from the centre than I think many people feared. That being said, I think actually if the RN come to power in France, they won't in the same way. I think there'll be far more trouble and far more authoritarian in nature than the brothers of Italy have been. So in a sense, you've got to judge them by what their platform is, by what they're saying. Jordan Bardella in France is using the sort of language that I think gives us cause for concern about what would happen if he was in power.
Well, it is going to be interesting to see how well they get on, actually, because they're not really forming alliances yet in the European Parliament.
No. But that's a sort of shock horror moment, isn't it?
Yes.
Right-wing nationalist parties can't compete.
They're nationalists.
Can't cooperate with foreigners.
Funny enough.
I mean, yeah.
I mean, the footage does remind Isabel as well of it's definitely an Italian peculiarity, and it is much remarked upon by people who've spent any time there, because you will run up against it sooner or later. Open nostalgia/affection for Benito Mussolini is far more common than the equivalent sentiment might be in Germany, obviously, where I think I'm right in saying that would still be pretty instantly career-ending.
I think it's a crime in Germany.
And might actually get see you in the clink. I'm not even sure you would long last in French politics after coming out and saying, well, Marshal Pétain, was he really all bad? But where does this sort of strange indulgence of Mussolini come from? How does it still happen?
Italians have no sense of history. Italians are a forgiving people. How can I guess at this?
It is absolutely extraordinary. And I do just want to bring it back, though, to the UK as well. And again, he's a hard man to feel sympathetic for. But you alluded to this, Anand, that we have heard Nigel Farage whinging that his party is somehow full of half-witted, illiterate racists, conspiracy theorists and weirdos. Yep. Do you think it ever occurs to them deep down where they live that, is it possible I'm the problem?
No, I think is the simple answer there. I think there's the serious point behind this is if you have a snap election, particularly for smaller parties, candidate vetting is an absolute nightmare. I mean, one of the reasons why we've seen standards sink so low in the House of Commons over the last few years is because we've had unexpected elections, which means candidates aren't properly vetted, and we've had a string of people, including, I should say, the Conservative MP for Wakefield, who ended up being thrown into jail, having not been vetted properly in, I think it was 2019 when he won. So I think having snap elections doesn't help the process for any party, because all of a sudden you're finding candidates in a terrible hurry and due diligences can't take place, which is not to excuse Nigel Farage in the least, but just to say that there are structural reasons why it was more difficult this time.
You do have to wonder how nervous Labour must be, because if their victory tomorrow is at the extreme end of projections, there's going to be a lot of people elected who did not have the least belief not long ago that they were ever actually going to win this thing. That's
true, though. Then again, all indications here, a hat tip to the heroic Michael Crick for all the work he did on candidate selection, is that Labour HQ exercised quite a lot of control in trying to pick safe candidates in this election.
Well, to Germany now, where the principle of finders keepers has been subjected to a stringent legal test and found wanting. A German police officer has been told to hand in his gun and badge after souveniring several rolls of cheddar from the scene of a cheese truck accident. The hapless highway patrolman's protests that the cheese wasn't worth much, would have spoiled, and that he doesn't much care for cheese himself anyway, fell upon deaf ears. He is, however, free to rebuild his life, hasn't been put in fetters. This build-up was probably not worth it on mature reflection, but here we all are. Would anybody care to make a judgment on this? Does anybody have any sympathy whatsoever for the patrolman?
Well, I mean, he's showing relatively good taste. He likes cheddar. Mm-hmm. This was 180 kilos of cheddar.
It was a lot of cheddar.
It was a lot of cheddar. No, I think if you're in uniform on a highway patrol and you're an armed policeman, leave the cheese alone.
Well, this was the judgment of those in power over him, but if we look at this with, I guess, like a ruggedly logical utilitarian view, Anand, does he not have a case? He said this cheese would have spoiled. It is unsellable. There has been a break in the cold chain, as they call it, that keeps cheese refrigerated between wherever it is they make cheese and wherever it is they sell cheese. It could not have been sold. It was just going to go on the tip. Is it not better that it is distributed among the friends and family of a generous highway patrolman?
I feel that Isabel and I are about to start the Law and Order party, because now I have absolutely no sympathy, and it wouldn't spoil. It would become mature cheddar, so therefore even nicer. So I don't believe him, and good.
He also did ask specifically for the undamaged packages, so, this wasn't entirely kind of for the good of humanity.
Is this only, though, are we only being this harsh because it is a uniformed police officer? If it was just a passerby, would they have done anything wrong if they just thought, well, it's only going to waste, I'll help myself?
Well, it depends if somebody else, if you're nicking somebody else's cheese, you probably have, but you wouldn't necessarily be fired from your job for it.
No.
You might.
I generally think theft is bad.
Yes, I think that's a fair point.
Yeah.
But, it's particularly bad in law enforcement officers on the whole. We don't like it.
God, we were hoping for controversy there.
He starts with the cheese, who knows where it ends up?
Well, absolutely. If you want controversy, I will point out that no MP from Bradford has ever gone to jail.
For nicking cheese?
Unlike Wakefield.
On that note of regional rivalry, Isabel Hilton and Anand Menon, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, tomorrow's conclusion of the UK's general election campaign will end a supremely stressful few weeks in the lives of Britain's political classes and those who report on them. Our next guest has pre-supplied what might be useful come-down reading. Politics, a Survivor's Guide by the columnist and reporter Raphael Baer, is a deft deconstruction of the manias which have consumed modern politics and an instruction manual for avoiding the rage or ennui they might provoke. I spoke to Raphael at Midori House earlier. I began by asking him about the terrifying personal episode that set him off writing this book in the first place.
The background to the book is that I had been writing about politics, thinking about politics, working hard in Westminster for many years, and also separate to that, been experiencing persistent chest pain whenever I exercised. And obviously being an educated and I thought fairly sort of informed person, I decided that this was nothing to worry about. And obviously, maybe just
the classic male approach to health concerns.
Absolutely. If you're out running, tight burning feeling on your chest, just ignore it. But then one day, it was New Year's Eve, actually, 2019, just after the UK general election, when Boris Johnson had won a massive majority, after a campaign that I had definitely not enjoyed covering, I went out and I had what I believe is technically known as a massive, great bloody heart attack. And I survived it, obviously, not fatal. That's just kind of spoiler alert there, otherwise I wouldn't be here. But it did really force me to reassess my relationship with politics. Look, I'm not saying politics gave me a heart attack. I smoked through most of my 20s, liked pastries, cardiovascular disease can't be inserted into you by Brexit or Jeremy Corbyn or Boris Johnson or anything else. But, I had to sort of find a different way of managing stress. And it was clear that something about my relationship with British politics, the state it was in, had been a hugely compounding factor in the stress. And if I wanted to go back to writing about it, because I couldn't write about anything else, couldn't start writing a column about cheese or anything. I wasn't even allowed to eat cheese anymore. So, obviously I had to think about politics differently. I wanted to try and diagnose the toxic substance in politics that I'd sort of been handling casually, seeping into my skin, that and I wasn't the only one. I know a lot of people who were MPs, advisors, other journalists, who felt really poisoned by politics.
Quite a few voters, I think, would probably agree with you over the last few years. There is a lot going on in the book in terms of what ails modern politics and what ails our responses to modern politics, and I guess how those two things feed into each other. There was one point which did strike me as especially interesting, because the more I thought about it, the more underrated I think it is, especially in people of broadly our age or thereabouts. There's been a lot of criticism, quite rightly, of a sort of toxic nostalgia for the Britain of the 1940s, and largely illusory, I'm sure it all is. You diagnosed quite early on a similar toxic nostalgia for the 1990s.
Yes, absolutely. And I am of the generation that sort of came of age politically in the UK in the sort of dying years of the John Major government. I just missed being able to vote in 1992. So the first general election I could participate in was 1997. Things can only get better. The Blair Revolution. And it just felt, it was a fantastic time to be young, independent, living in London, which felt like the capital of the world. There was this great alignment. It was the sort of the absolute peak of optimistic globalization. The Cold War was over. Apartheid had collapsed in South Africa. There was a peace process in the Middle East. The Northern Ireland peace process was working. I mean, it was a hugely optimistic time. And I think our generation really were lulled into a kind of complacent view that this was a normal process. This is what politics should feel like, as opposed to a bit of a blip. And I think one of the hardest things for me in terms of dealing with some of the unravelling of that consensus, particularly Brexit, which, I was a Remainer. I felt very passionately about, not wanting Britain to leave the European Union. And the lazy, easy thing to do then would be to think all these awful reactionary nationalists have sort of stolen democracy from me and it's not fair and they're all terrible fascists and racists or whatever it is. And people were saying that sort of thing. And I think the harder thing to process and the more honest thing to do was to consider, well, which part of my assumption about the way politics should be, the nice, cosy, liberal, pro-globalization consensus, has got so much complacency in it that actually those of us who supported that consensus for the generation actually have a bit of complicity in what's gone on here. We really neglected and ignored some of the stuff that was happening elsewhere in the country, out in the periphery, and we need to own a little bit of what's happened here. I
mean, your central thesis, and do feel free to correct me if I have misread it, it's the book is basically a long, multifaceted plea for a calmer politics, a calmer approach to politics, and a calmer response to politics. But what I wonder, and I have been wondering when looking at certainly the United Kingdom and the United States over the last decade or so in particular, is do we, i.e. those people, and I am among them, who would prefer things to be a bit calmer and a bit more thoughtful and a bit more rational, do we have to reckon with the fact that a lot of people are actually genuinely enjoying the toxicity? They enjoy the row, they enjoy the drama, they want to see what happens next.
Absolutely. And I do think it's incredibly important to understand a couple of dynamics in that respect. There's at one point I quote Clive James, who's a writer and a thinker that I really admire, and he talks about the sort of the boredom that can just lead, if when a political climate achieves, he uses a wonderful phrase,
vibrating stasis.
Yeah, when you get a condition of vibrating stasis, basically a sort of an intellectual elite sometimes reacts by just getting bored, and when they're bored they start playing with fire. And there was certainly, you saw this in Brexit, you've seen all kinds of other sort of populist movements. An element of it is legitimate frustration and rage of people who felt left behind by the globalization consensus, people who felt they'd been neglected, patronized and ignored by politics. But it's also mobilized by people who are actually part of the establishment elite, or, from one segment of an established elite, who basically feel they haven't had their turn on the levers of power for a while and basically like the sound of breaking glass because it's more thrilling. And so in short answer, I think, yes, that's right. But also there's a separate and much harder element to this that I think we have to process, which is, in the third decade of the 21st century, in developed economies, affluent societies, it's the challenges that are left, that are remaining. So it's not just a question of putting roofs over people's heads, making sure there's enough nutrition in people's bodies, eliminating death in childbirth. 100 years ago, people often didn't even survive the first 5 years of life just because it was so dangerous. So the benchmark of what constitutes progress has now got quite developed and quite sophisticated. And so it's just incredibly complicated. None of it's simple anymore. And so it's just very difficult for a politician of the centre ground, a moderate politician, to address people who are still feeling very frustrated, still feeling that there's something missing from their lives, and say, I'm afraid the thing that you want, it's not quite available and it's very hard and there are lots of compromises you have to make. When you're competing against people who are saying, yeah, you're angry, here's a simple solution, we can fix this. Those people are responsible. They're either the foreigners or whatever it is. And if we just eliminate that or yank ourselves out of the European Union or build a wall between the US and Mexico, whatever it is, to compete against that when your message is, I don't really have the answer, just bear with me a little bit while we try and work through this equation. That's the thing that I find hardest, or that I think we really have to grapple with, is thinking, what is an effective communication of politics that can make yes, it's complicated, but we can do this together, as compelling a message as here's a simple solution that's actually snake oil.
Well, just finally, and on that thought, and obviously given the political climate we've been discussing, attempting optimism does seem a somewhat vainglorious exercise, but it's almost certain that very shortly after this interview airs, the United Kingdom will elect a broadly centrist government led by a slightly dull, but I suspect competent man who does talk in relative complexity and nuance and is poised to win a landslide. Now, that may well be a vote against the other mob rather than a vote for him. But nonetheless, do you see in that possibility any remedy for the ailments you diagnose?
I certainly think it's important that, when this happens, I think it almost certainly will happen, that people don't, I think it's very tempting to go, yes, well, it's just a rejection of the Conservatives, and actually he's this sort of bland blank slate, Keir Starmer, onto which people project whatever they want, and actually, there's no clear agenda there. Certainly, I think there'll be a lot of people on the left of politics who think, well, why doesn't it have the enthusiasm? Why aren't there massive rallies of people cheering his name down the street? And obviously people on the right saying, well, this is just, it won't solve anything, there's nothing really there. And actually, the reality is there's never that much enthusiasm for prime ministers or leaders. When there's enthusiasm for politicians, it tends to be quite niche. So when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party...
It's small and noisy.
It's small and noisy, exactly. And actually, nearly always a bubble that then bursts. Or, there's, by definition, that the great enthusiasm for a political leader tends to be, aligned with where you are on sort of slightly more demagogic end of the scale. So actually, if Keir Starmer comes in with a huge majority and, representing all areas of the country, it is genuinely an opportunity, and I hope he takes it, to turn around and go, look, actually, this is not the country that Nigel Farage or Boris Johnson or plenty of others, or Suella Braverman or whoever it is, thinks it is, and said it was. We've had now 5 or 6 years of a certain group of people saying true patriotism looks like this, and the people who are against that are liberal globalists. They're not really authentically British in some sort of slightly sinister way. They're that culture of thinking the authentic, honest expression of Britishness turns out actually not to be the majority. And if I think Keir Starmer can stand up and say, the silent majority of Britain has stood up and said, actually, we just kind of want decent, normal, functional, competent government, he's right. And that in itself will be a mandate for him to do some quite interesting things.
That was Raphael Baer speaking to me earlier. Raphael's new book, Politics, A Survivor's Guide, is out now and very much recommended. This is all for that. That is all for this edition. This is all that. They go the other way around. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Anand Menon and Isabel Hilton. Today's show was produced by Henry Rhys Sheridan and researched by Gunnar Gronlid. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.